Thank you very much, Yanis, Sophie, Philippe, and the entire Reset group here. It's really an honor for me to be here. And I think this topic is very important because there's a lot of misconceptions about who Roma are and their history, their present day situation. And in a sense, Roma have been seen as essentially migratory. What does that even mean? They are an essentially migratory ethnicity or even the word race. Well, what we have to do is decouple some of these concepts to see what Romani history is, how migration has been studied, and why even the word nomad has been attached to them as an essential trait. I mentioned the work of Nando Sigona, who wrote a classic article, How Can a Nomad Be a Refugee? Now, we do know that Roma are a diaspora people from India, but does India really matter to people who are in re-diasporization from Europe to many other places? So India, there are many homelands for Roma historically, but which ones do matter? But we do have to pay attention to the fact that probably half of East European Roma now live in Western Europe and are under the rubric of abusers of welfare, social misfits, whatever. And so we have to take account of historic racialization, stereotyping, which gets renegotiated over and over in different contexts. So, of course, there's a long history of discrimination against Roma. In fact, Adrian Magari said it may be the last acceptable form of racism. We have to talk about terminology too, because you will see in various media discourses and political tracts these words. What do they even mean? Well, the racialization of Roma is pretty obvious. The word Roma is an internal etymology, but is not always used even by all Roma because there are so many subgroups. But outsider racialization terms include being blacks in many areas of Eastern Europe, and all the variations of the word Tsigan, Zigeuner, which actually comes from a Byzantine heretical sect, a kind of outsider group that then got transferred to all of these variants of the etymology. And the word gypsy itself, which you notice I'm not using, and as a non-Roma person, I never use it unless we're talking about stereotypification. The word gypsy comes from Egyptian, which is false history and false etymology, but yet some people are actually using it in, like, for example, the UK, where the terminology GRT is actually acceptable policy. Gypsies, Roma, and travelers. Travelers are actually descendant from Irish people who were displaced and have occupied some of the same niches as Roma and intermarried in some parts of Scotland and England. But in general, all of these words have a negative connotation. The gypsy part of town, the inferior part of town. So we will get into this little by little in my talk, but one of the most important points I want to make is that Roma are alive and well, and their identity is strong. Now, this is like 1,000-year-old, almost a miracle that Roma have retained their ethnicity and their identity work is worth exploring. So, despite huge challenges, there are incredible movements to reclaim agency, voice, space, identity, reviving language. And in many migratory places, this is again a renegotiation of who we are. In many migratory places in Western Europe, people have told me when I'm at my wedding or sitting in my living room with my relatives from 5 different European countries, I actually feel secure for once in my life. I feel good. So I mentioned the Rome Archive, which is a very good and free resource for you to look at your leisure. But underlying all of these issues is me here as a non-Romani person who insisted on inviting Mirjam Karoly as a Roma activist because I think collaborative work is absolutely required at this moment. Historically, everything that has been written about Roma and pictured as Roma has been produced by non-Roma. Okay, so who gets to define what even this group is? It's been outsiders. So we're at a moment of decolonization of Romani studies in terms of methodology, but even the production of knowledge, the epistemology of what we're talking about. The terminology nothing about us without us, which came from disability studies, has been adopted by Roma. And my positionality as a non Romani person has changed because I have also been a product of the change of decades of the framing of Romani studies. Even in my early work, I used the word gypsy, which I now disavow. So for non Roma, it's especially important to be reflexive. That means looking at yourself, and reciprocal, which means sharing your work at various stages. So, collaboration, as we know, can happen in defining your topic, in the methodologies, in sharing the written work, in doing something with the written work afterwards, like an activist projects and advocacy. So, that's where I'm at now. Now, these stereotypes I'm talking about are very old and they're not going away. In fact, they're intensified now and they are a continuum, the romantic on one pole and the criminal. So we have to remember that Roma are also pictured in a positive way as musicians, artists, people who do food well, who dress in beautiful manners. All of these are obviously gendered stereotypes as well. And since I study music, I want to emphasize that musicians sometimes are the privileged class in their societies and in relation to mobility are often the most mobile because they are required for celebrations in various sites. And if they have the documents, or even if they don't, they manage to travel. However, even the most privileged and the most romantically stereotyped Roma also face the criminal stereotype. The musicians I work with, they may be in a global stage, but as soon as they walk off the stage, they may be surveilled. They may have inferior lodging, food or no food at even the biggest festivals where they are winning prizes. So, this criminal stereotype is about thievery, about watching your wallet, and it applies specifically in migration about unworthiness. And we'll talk about this a little later. When I teach about Roma, my students consistently say this is what they know about gypsies 100%. Okay? So we have to realize that media and literature, music, paintings all fit into this stereotype. Food, the soul of a gypsy, that is spirituality. And here's from Knoxville, Tennessee, an event by the Opera, an elite art organization that had a fundraiser encouraging people to dress up as gypsies so they could have a fun event called Gypsies, Tramps, and Thieves from the Cher text of her song. And then we also have to deal with, again, the kind of magic or the power of gypsy arts that are appropriated regularly by non-Roma. Okay, so in the US, we have festivals of gypsy music with no Roma. That would be absurd with pretty much any other ethnic group. And this word that I think came out 4 or 5 years ago, gypster, a combination of hipster and gypsy, somebody who wanders and has spiritual power, musical power, and beauty as well. So, opposite of the romantic stereotype comes the suspicious Roma criminal stereotype. And I'm just giving you a few samples of what's going on today and yesterday and the week before and the month before. This is the demolition of over 80 homes in Sofia, Bulgaria, the evening before Easter, as people were starting to celebrate. And this is a neighborhood that is over 100 years old, but again, is targeted as illegal dwellings. So we also have to look at the institutional structure of who belongs where according to what documents historically. And these demolitions are not new. They've been happening in Bulgaria for a really long time and in other places as well. And I'm using Bulgarian examples. My case study a little later will be from the Balkans, but I'll read you. But it is very striking. These marches and neo-Nazi discourse, and if you remember this, the beating of a young boy because he said that Roma are equal, and his neighbor actually beat him up and filmed it because he was so proud of beating up this boy. And it started an international dialogue, I stand with Nico, but most of the comments on social media were actually racist. And of course, this is part of the pan European discourse of neo nationalism and patriotism and inwardness, where you find your enemies, this complex enemy configuration that include Roma, migrants, Muslims, LGBTQ, gender studies. There'll be others in the future because there are always people to finger and hate. And to me, this is really important to realize that they are using our terminology from anthropology, from history, from the social sciences. Words like heritage, tradition, culture mean something different for neo nationalists. We need to take back our discourse because we understand it in an inclusive way. And not to just make Bulgaria the example, there are many examples throughout Europe, especially during migration, where we see Ukrainian refugees are welcome, but Roma refugees from Ukraine are isolated, given inferior lodging, social services, or even evicted from refugee centers. And you also might remember the Greek blonde Horia incident, because this is southern migration, but it's to a Western country. So this young girl was found in a Greek Roma settlement, and the police immediately assumed she was abducted. So here's a whiteness out of place. A white girl in a dark person's neighborhood. She must have been stolen. That trope of stealing children is hundreds of years old. And it elicited responses of racism as far as the UK, where it was recorded that were targeted, young kids were even targeted in schools. Are you abducted? Are you really Roma? This is migration to the south, but it's to a Western country. So just to recap, Roma are the largest minority in Europe today. The majority reside in EU nation states, and they have, again, a very sad profile of low rates of political participation, education, social integration. By all markers, all statistics, Roma are actually suffering. And migration, sometimes, even often, is the only path to safety and middle class from east to west. But historically, we're talking about a bigger migration. Okay, so we're talking about different levels and different decades. So we're talking about a migration from India since 1000. And many people say that this is a diaspora. Yes, but this is only one part of a multiple levels of diaspora. And if you can see in this map, Roma are in many different places, and naturally, there are many different subgroups with different cultural configurations, language and religion, multiple religions, and so on. So we have words that reflect this, such as city, which is important in Germany and in Central Europe, as one of the groups that want to claim a separate name from Roma, or as I mentioned earlier, Gypsies, Roma travelers, that is used in the UK. Some of historical occupations actually did depend on some kind of mobility. So when we talk about nomads in general, in nomadic theories, we can talk about pastoral nomads that have nothing to do with Roma. They do not move animals, but service nomads that provide services in different places: music and metalwork, woodworking. Now, these services, first of all, were integral to peasant life. It is impossible to cook without Roma. It is impossible to get from one place to another due to horse sales and horse doctoring, horse metal equipment, the loom. All of these basic peasant features were provided by Roma. And I would mention that in ethnographic museums today throughout Europe, these objects exist, but they are not labeled at all. So there's an invisible layer of Roma productivity, you might say labor productivity, that is nowhere to be found. And I think it's time to decolonize those collections. There have been exhibits on Roma, but separate exhibits. I'm talking about integrating the permanent ethnographic village displays. Other occupations: music and dance, animal training. Some women were involved in fortune telling, not all. So some of these occupations might have required regional mobility. But again, to label all Roma as nomadic is actually wrong. Okay? Then we have to look at other types of labor categories that came later on, where Roma were relegated to low class factory work during socialism. Street sweepers were all Roma, and they continue actually to work in the waste collection business today in post-socialism. But obviously, there are many, many intellectual Roma, and education levels have soared among the Roma population. So if we look at the different periods of history, we see some striking things. Okay, we see removals right here in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, removals of children from their parents to de-gypsify them and make them into good members of the empire, or this emerging national states. This happened in Spain as well as here. UK rules about where Roma can stay and where you can shoot at them, where you have the right to shoot them off your property. Socialist assimilation measures, forced sterilization. I can go on and on and on. But there are two periods that I must mention specifically: the Nazi period and also slavery. Let me, let's see. Oh, here. Yeah. What did I just... Okay, let me talk about the Nazi period first, then I'll go back to slavery. I thought I had the slavery here. Okay, so we know now through very new but very detailed research that about 500,000, maybe more, Roma perished in the Holocaust as a targeted group. So we can use the word genocide. And there were certain things that are obvious once we look at the historical materials, such as the physical anthropological work that documented meticulously the head shapes of Roma, the kinship systems of Roma by the racial units of the Nazi regime. And here we have Dr. Robert Ritter taking information, research specifically about Roma. Also, Joseph Mengele, who did, quote, research, which was really torture of twin Roma children, now is well documented. And probably the most famous face that we might know from the Holocaust is actually a Roma person, a Roma young girl that was mislabeled as a Jewish girl until very, very recently. We also know about the Auschwitz Gypsy camp because this was a pretty special configuration where women and children were allowed to live together. And we know about its liquidation, the exact date. And here in Austria, there is very important documentation and activism about Holocaust of the Roma, as well as Jews as well. So there have been statistics produced about Roma losses in Burgenland, about the specific Zigeuner lager in that area. And August 2nd, now you know why August 2nd was chosen, because the liquidation is the Memorial Day. The EU Parliament has recognized the Roma Holocaust fairly recently, but I think Austria doesn't recognize historical dates per se, so it is not per se recognized. But there are a few memorial sites in this country, and even one in Vienna, which was a deportation site for Jews, but including Roma as well. Okay, and that's right here. And you have some very, very famous activist artists who lived after the Holocaust, survived, and documented their lives, such as Chaya Stoika. You have Chaya Stoika Square here in Vienna. She survived 3 concentration camps. She died in 2013. Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen. Of her family of 200 people, only 6 survived. Her 2 brothers are also writers and activists. They are from the Lovara group of subgroup of Roma, who were horse traders and other types of traders. And she started painting at the age of 56 and documented her life before the Holocaust and during the Holocaust in amazing colors and symbols. I will say just briefly that we had a Chaya Stoika exhibit in New York last year, which was sponsored by the Austrian Austrian Cultural Center, and it was very well attended and very nicely put on. But in the opening, I was disappointed that the Roma aspect really was not addressed head on. In fact, the man sitting next to me after the opening speeches said to me, "Oh, so Chaya Stoik is Jewish, right?" So, I mean, you have to keep saying this over and over and over again for audiences to understand. Okay. The second night after the opening, Chaya Stoika's granddaughter did read her poetry and memoir, and we had a local Roma activist, Petra Gelbart, speak about the Romani experience. But she is a local treasure for you. And last year, I attended the Barranca Park commemoration right here, which is sponsored by Voices of Diversity. And Barranca Park this year was the 17th annual gathering, was again a deportation site of Roma political dissenters, Jews, homosexuals, and so on, disabled people. And the initiator of this particular site was Mongo Stoika, Chaya Stoika's brother, and he named it after his grandmother. So that's why it's called this. So these are very important activist projects. So in general, activism has increased tremendously since 1989. Not only Holocaust recognition, but the use of the flag and anthem that was taken from an early 1971 Roma Congress, conferences, lobbying, language revitalization, school curriculum initiatives are in progress. But at every stage, fighting to get to the next stage. And we've already introduced Angela Kotza, but she is a really, really important person for Romani studies in academia and in feminism, and she'll be making some remarks a little later on. You also should know about your own Romano Centro since 1991, which unites the diverse groups of Roma right here. Urgeman Roma, Lovada, Sinti, Adlia from the Balkans, Halderash from Poland, Russia, Gurbet, which actually means migrant worker. Some groups actually use that word for themselves, the self-designation. And this is a project they've just started on work. And the official recognition of the Austrian minority of Roma, which is really important because other European countries do not readily have this, came about because of an alliance of Roma and non-Roma people sitting here. Ursula Hemetek, I hope she will speak a little later on, winner of the Wittgenstein Award and founder of the Music and Minorities Research Center at the University of Performing Arts, was very, very active, as well as Ruja Nikolic Lakatos, who was a singer and activist, and now the Center for Music and Minority Studies has an incredible website about her songs, the texts, and what they did in the world. I also want to mention Christine Afenes Yuhas, who is an archivist at your phonographom and has been incredibly important in documenting the materials we have, including the incredible collection of Moses Heinching, who is a language and music expert and has been a consultant for all of these projects. So, just moving to why Rome will also eliminate theoretical concept of migration. Well, I don't have to tell you all this history of migration research, but Roma can help us to actually interrogate, does this apply and why not? So, the early frameworks of immigration from one land to the new land. Well, is India important to Roma? Yes, it might be important in revitalization in fashion, music, and even food, because Roma are learning they're from India. But nobody is returning to India. Nobody is communicating except Modi, who wants to establish Romani studies and co opt it into a Hindu nationalist project. So when we receive invitations from India, we're not going. Okay, diaspora. Again, early diaspora studies assumes a singular homeland. This does not apply to Roma, okay? It's not unidirectional. So Roma have multiple homelands. When I talk to Roma in New York from Macedonia and they say the word home, Doma, or Khan, their land, they say it's Macedonia. They're not thinking of India at all. And when they travel, they may not go to Macedonia. They go to Frankfurt or to Dortmund to visit other relatives who are in these spokes of rediasporization. So we are really looking at a transnational framework. And you know this as migration scholars, that we're looking at how things relate from point to point in multi-directional ways. Human flows focus on borders, imagined communities, and even a little later, the word mobilities. So when we say Roma are a migratory people, what does that mean? Are they essentially mobile, or have they been evicted? Have they faced persecution and had to travel, or are they economic migrants? This is an important um, debate in Western Europe. And what does it even mean to say you have to be either an economic migrant or you are an asylum seeker who faced persecution? These are actually not binary categories. Okay. I use work like Paul Gilroy in my analysis because it combines culture, music, and this kind of transnational attitude. And now we are part of a project called not the Black Atlantic, but the Romani Atlantic, or even it's been suggested to look at the Romani Adriatic or the Romani Mediterranean. This would be very, very fruitful. So now focusing on the Balkans a little bit, because I think, yeah, I think I should go into my case study a little bit here. I want to talk about migration specifically from the Balkans, whether it's irregular, regular, with documentation, working under the cable. The musicians I know, for example, some may have visas, some may have Schengen. It doesn't matter. They figure out a way to get to the paying gig that keeps their family fed. Okay, that's really, really important. But it didn't start after 1989. Certainly from the Balkans, we have the Yugoslav example of the Gastarbeiter program, which you guys really know. And more recently, this kind of hysteria as each nation joins the EU of who's coming here and how fast and how many. Okay, so this hysteria about gypsy invasions. We have Berlusconi fingerprinting all Roma just in case they will have a criminal incident. Okay, a database sounds very familiar from the Nazis. Okay, and many, many expulsions back. People who have grown up in Germany and in France are back in Kosovo. And of course, the Syrian refugee crisis was a whole other reframing of who's a migrant, who's a worthy migrant, who fails to integrate, who is fraudulent. Okay? So The numbers are really large for Roma. Many, well, actually for non-Roma too. Many villages, depending, doesn't matter if it's Roma or not, are actually empty in the Balkans. But for Roma, over half, I would say, are living in Western Europe. Now, most Roma go home and bring money, remittances, and pave their driveways and add another level to their house and have their weddings and really invest back in the Balkans. Okay, that's really important. I've seen Romani neighborhoods improved tremendously since 1989. But we also have to see that in relation to the Balkan route for other people. Okay, so how are migrants seen in relation to each other? Not all migrants are equal. And in my last section, I want to focus on Kosovo Roma. Now, I've worked a lot with Macedonian, Serbian Roma, Bulgarian Roma, but I'm focusing specifically on Kosovo Roma because of the stark situation of war and trauma. Okay? So I'm talking about a group that does not go home to visit because their neighborhoods have been destroyed or they've been displaced to other villages and put in Serbian neighborhoods that have no contact with their Albanian neighbors. And it's a very complex situation and it's not well known. So, this is a family photo which is treasured because many Kosovo Roma left in the middle of the night in very stark expulsions and evictions in 1999 and took whatever they could. Women and men were separated. Many men are still in trauma. There's high rates of depression, uh, post traumatic stress disorder, still today, another generation down. Um, and I'm interested in how resilience, cultural memory gets rebuilt out of fragments, okay, in these disparate communities. So these Roma live, as well as Macedonian, Serbian, and Bulgarian Roma, live in multi sided communities. They all have relatives in five, six countries. When they gather, it is a secure place for their people. Okay. But some people can't come because they don't have documents. So the use of social media is really, really important. So, just to give you an insight of how this happened, this is the last stage of the Yugoslav wars, the conflict between Serbs and Albanians. But the Kosovo Roma refused to take sides, and they were perceived by the majority Albanians as traitors. Okay? So, NATO didn't evict them, Albanians evicted them. Okay? And this was a violent eviction, quick. And I'm talking about 2/3 of the Kosovo population. Okay. And if you see the term Roma, Ashtali, and Egyptians, that means different subgroups. Ashtali speak Albanian and Egyptians speak Albanian. There have been many historic ways that Roma tried to pass out of the stigmatized categories that they're in. And sometimes they might identify as Turks, and these are fairly new terms. Egyptian actually isn't that new. So I'm interested in what happens with trauma and remigration. Families had to bribe multiple mafias to get out of Kosovo, to cross first Albanian or Serbian mafias, and then Italian mafias, and then various other mafias. And there are very tragic narratives of war and escape. Men were sometimes separated, and women had to negotiate entire mafia economic exchanges with these mafias. So again, seeing how these people are emplaced where they are, many of them want to move to Germany for its beneficial social welfare, but can't. They're kind of stuck in Italy, for example. And they feel quite ambivalent about homeland. Many of them never go back. The ones that go back to try to get a legal right to their property, not to live there, but to get some money to live in Germany or Dortmund or wherever. And this hardly ever succeeds, but a few cases have, and it takes years and years and lawyers and lobbying and so on. And in their remigratory places, they feel more secure than the moment of eviction but home is still Kosovo. So they look, for example, at old photos, and even there are Kosovo Roma, many of them still left there, and they are in contact, and even some family members. And what's striking also is the nostalgia for Yugoslavia, because actually in Kosovo, in the Yugoslav period, the rates of Roma education and cultural investment were higher than in other parts of Yugoslavia and even other parts of the Balkans. So we have in Germany, I'm specifically uh, focusing on Germany, lots of different iterations of refugee policy, whether they're refugees or relegated to no, they're not facing persecution as, quote, refugees. They are economic migrants who abuse the economic system. So many of these Roma have been in Duldom or temporary status, that means deportable, for decades. Okay, some have moved out, but it's very, very hard to get permission to move out. Some have, and there are many who have businesses. A family I visited recently refurbishes refrigerators and stoves and heating systems, and this is really necessary because people want use appliances, and it's cheaper getting a new appliance, and it's an entire network of bringing in old ones, refurbishing them, and then selling them out. This same family had a pizza parlor earlier, and earlier they had a package business of delivering things throughout Europe, like DHL, but a version of that. So again, a lot of economic adaptation, and this is historic for Roma. They figure out the adaptation to make a living. Okay, and I want to mention also that the conditions in Kosovo, aside from their neighborhoods now being occupied by Albanians, and some of them have high rises, they're very valuable property in downtown Pristina, for example. That in some parts of Kosovo, for example, have health disasters for Roma. This particular case of, um, let's see, let me show you here, camps for Roma that were established. Again, displaced people after 1999 were given a place to stay. But guess what? It was on contaminated land with lead. And for 10 years, children grew up on this. And even the UN monitored it and kept saying, yes, we should move them. And in 2016, the UN condemned itself for this health disaster. And still, there are few results except for deformities. So memory work is very, very important for this group and for many, many groups. And it happens through celebrations. It happens through ritual. It happens with music. It happens with gendered performances. Okay? So there are huge weddings, circumcision parties. Some might be other religions, and yet they use their older traditions that are reformed. Now, space is also very interesting in Western Europe because Roma like to gather, and there might be many of them, and they want to have music. But in Germany, you can't have loud music on the street. That is, unless there's enough of you to claim space. So, this Dortmund apartment house is a kind of new center of one neighborhood from Pristina that is rebuilding itself. And there are so many Pristina Roma here that they actually have claimed the parking lot for their weddings and can have brass bands there. So this is really, really extraordinary. And many of the symbols of tradition from the Balkans are still used and then reinvented, such as women dancing with the sieve, which is a fertility symbol, to at the front of the dance line. The front of the dance line is a place of respect, and the elders are called up one by one to lead. But in the beginning of weddings and other ceremonies with the sieve. Okay, so gender is really important too in this revitalization. Even it's very interesting to me that even very educated Roma women in that old traditions that seem very patriarchal, like with their head down or a modest gaze looking at their hands, for the purpose of respecting their elders and the old ways of life, even though they may be making more money than their husbands, supporting their households, and have a lot more freedom. But in ritual, they enact an older ideal of tradition. So here's that decorated sieve. So it's very important to see how gender plays out in these new places. And I'm coming to the end here. I think it's really important to see how what symbols take on new meanings in the diaspora. In New York, for example, and I've seen it here a little bit, I just went to actually a Serbian Roma event on this past Sunday, which was a party for the first birthday and the baptism of two little girls. So that whereas boys might have if you're Muslim, you would have a circumcision party, or they're prioritized in celebrations. Now girls are getting their own parties. In New York, we have Sweet 16 parties, graduation parties, bridal showers that are as big as a wedding, because people in in this re-diaspora want their culture more and more as a safe place, and they are learning about who they are through the text of the songs. They may not speak Romanes anymore, but they know the words of the songs and they can sing along. Okay, so these are some ceremonial pictures from rituals around Europe. This is from Bremen. You can see, again, a very modest bride, but again, she may be more educated than her husband or even her in laws, who she will live with, but this is performative. So I think the focus on the security of the family, which is embedded in performative gender roles, is reinvigorated in response to migration and exclusion. So not only are you in a new place, you are also excluded when you try to get a job in the neighborhood office. So there's lots of factors that combine for this identity work. I haven't I don't really have time to go into the rise of different religions, but religion is very important. Islamicization is growing, but also evangelical religions are growing, and some people change. And in families, one sibling can be one religion, and another sibling can be another religion. But these transnational networks invigorate this re-diaspora. And so I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.